My mother was foolish. That is certain. Yesterday I wrote something like, "Just now, after 100 years has passed, I understand." But as I thought, I cannot say that she was not completely foolish. But in actuality, far more foolish than my mother was my father. A little while after my mother died, no, it wasn't even a little while, I now realize that, the violence that had been up to that point been directed towards my mother was now all done towards me. He beat me on an everyday basis. I was a child, so he of course hit me when I made childlike mistakes. But even when I did something well, even as a child, if for some reason it rubbed him the wrong way, he would beat me even worse than when I made mistakes, to the point where I bled. It was almost as if he thought beating a child was a form of training. I've heard some twisted words like, "Go ahead and beat your child. Even if you don't know the reason why, that child will know why." But as a child back then, I didn't understand at all. No, actually I soon understood. I understood that there was no reason. My father was just the kind of man who tyrannized weaker people in order to affirm his own dominance. My mother was foolish, truly and hopelessly foolish. But even if she wasn't, even if she had a personality that was fitting for that town, I'm sure my father would have found some other reason to tyrannize my mother. I thought that without a doubt it was because my mother was mistaken, because my mother was so foolish that she was beaten like that. But all that had nothing to do with it. And what I said about how she would have minimized the damage if she'd only stayed quiet, I think that may have not been so. So he began to hit me without any significant reason. He was always irritated. He was constantly in a bad mood. He was so violent that he was unable not to take his anger out on something. In order to create strong zombies, I found many wicked people, like Jack the Ripper, for example. But even compared to that famous villain, my father was by no means inferior. He was a hopeless thug. He was a stingy lowlife, but when I think of just how strong a zombie he would have become had I turned him into a zombie, I think how that man truly was the father of me. Dio. Though just thinking that is discomforting. Anyhow, that man was a foolish man who had an inferiority complex even towards his wife and children. It would not have been as strange if he'd lost his life after living it in non-stop violence. What I did to escape my father's violence was, at the time, work. I worked, I earned money, and I used that money to give my father liquor. When he was drunk, his violence was all the more impossible to restrain, but if you ignored that and let him keep drinking, then he would eventually drink himself unconscious. And of course, my father could not commit violence towards me if he was asleep. Nonetheless, I was a child. Even though I call it work, it wasn't legitimate work at all, of course. But in that savage town, it had its own savage system. Even if they weren't legitimate, there were many jobs to do. They would take kickbacks like it were natural to do so the money a child could earn never amounted to much. But gambling went on all over the town, so it was easy to increase that into enough to buy liquor. I made use of my mother's education here. The education she gave me when I was very young. I first made use of it in gambling. I'm sure that would have been very much against what she'd have wanted. When I think of that, it's very ironic, because it was then that I first felt grateful to her. I thought how it was thanks to her that I was able to live today. It was the first time I was appreciative to her. He himself couldn't earn much money, so when his young son bought him liquor, my father expectedly got in a bad mood and hit me. But to that drunkard man, liquor took priority over anything, apparently, and he stopped hitting me little by little. It seems even that man was capable enough to calculate that if he hit me so bad that I couldn't move, he wouldn't get booze anymore. And so I thought, I knew it. My mother was wrong. That's what I thought in my childish mind. While I was thankful for the knowledge and cultivation she'd given me, I felt that my mother was still mistaken and foolish. Even though I was very young, I felt the decision was very unlike me. Or perhaps back then, no matter how much I scorned her as being hopelessly foolish, even though I don't want to admit it, if it's necessary to get to heaven, I must admit to that as well. I was right. My mother was wrong. If father only quit drinking, he'd be a nice person. It's not true at all, is it? Far from it. It's more like the more he drinks, the kinder he gets, doesn't he? Though not to the degree of my father, but perhaps to the degree of my mother, when I thought that way, I may have been foolish. A mistake because of youth. A careless mistake because I was a child. To think that not being beaten by my parents meant they were nice. It's laughable, but for the boy Dio, that was a magnificent discovery. As a child, until I reached a more advanced age, I constantly devoted myself to forcing my small body to do an unreasonable amount of hard work in order to earn booze money for my father. I'm getting really put off by this. I'll put my pen down here for today.